Hi everyone, greetings from the internet. I'm Greg DeSantis from your cohort. To be more specific, I have a beard and this is my voice. So now that we have that settled, this is my presentation on my dissertation, which focused on satisfactory academic progress policy and its relationship with and effects on community college student retention in Connecticut. Satisfactory academic progress, or SAP, is a federally required policy for higher education institutions that offer Title IV aid. SAP policy establishes whether students have a GPA as well as a pace of course completion that are high enough to keep getting financial aid. Individual institutions get to define many aspects of their own SAP policy. The previous statewide community college SAP policy in Connecticut was largely fixed, with most students required to maintain a 2.0 GPA and 2/3 completion pace, which are very common thresholds at institutions across the country. Most students falling below the 2.0 GPA and 2/3 completion pace in the 2014 cohort became ineligible for aid. The new statewide community college SAP policy in Connecticut was progressive, meaning that students did not need to reach the 2.0 GPA and 2/3 completion pace until later in their academic career. Earlier in their career, if they met certain lower GPA and completion pace standards, they would maintain aid eligibility. One additional component to the new policy was mandatory advising for students falling below the eventual 2.0 GPA and 2/3 completion pace standards. These students were prevented from registering until they met with an advisor. This study analyzed whether the progressive SAP policy improved semester-to-semester retention for students attending community colleges in Connecticut. This helped to fill a substantial gap in the literature. Previous research had not examined whether certain SAP policies, such as those that were progressive or those that were fixed, were likely to positively or negatively affect student retention. This study was framed by the need for social justice in higher education. This is early research about whether aspects of SAP policies are equitably affecting students as they seek their college completion goals. Before we proceed, I must ask you to exercise caution, SAP fans. This dissertation was the pilot phase of a longer-term study that will analyze retention and completion for students over 6 semesters. The present study only looks at 2 semesters of data, during which virtually all students would have retained SAP eligibility both before and after the policy change. It's not recommended that these preliminary results be used when making institutional SAP policy decisions. That said, there's early information in this study that may help to inform future research. The research method employed was quantitative, with a correlational research design as implemented through logistic regression analysis. Logistic regression was used to determine the strength of the relationship between the dependent variable, which was semester-to-semester retention, and specific independent variables including age, race and ethnicity, sex, number of remedial mathematics and English credits attempted, dependency according to the FAFSA, and the estimated family contribution, or EFC, from the FAFSA. The overall retention rate of the pre-policy change cohort was also compared to the overall retention rate of the post-policy change cohort. The pre-policy change sample comprised all 6,289 first-time ever in college students enrolled in between 3 and 21.5 credit hours during fall 2014 at the 12 community colleges in Connecticut, who also received any form of federal student aid. The post-policy change sample comprised all 5,948 first-time ever in college students, again enrolled in between 3 and 21.5 credit hours during fall 2017 at the 12 community colleges, who also received any form of federal aid. Both cohorts included mostly students who were 24 or younger. Both cohorts included slightly more students who identified as female than students who identified as male. Both cohorts included roughly the same percentage of Asian students and Black or African American students. The 2014 cohort had more white students than Hispanic Latino students, while the 2017 cohort had more Hispanic Latino students than white students. More than 3/4 of the students in both cohorts were retained to the second semester, although in 2014, almost 1.5 percentage points more students were retained. Remember, only 2 semesters of post-policy change data is currently available. On its surface, this is a counterintuitive finding. One would suppose that a more progressive policy with lower GPA and completion pace thresholds earlier in the student's career would yield higher rates of student retention. However, keep in mind that students in both cohorts maintained aid eligibility through their second semester in almost all cases. At the same time, the 2017 policy added an advising hold requirement for students who fell below the 2.0 GPA and 2/3 completion pace threshold. This advising hold may have served as a deterrent for some students, either causing them to decide not to meet with the advisor at all and drop out, or causing them to reflect on their performance after meeting with the advisor and deciding at that point not to register for the next semester. I'll continue to track this trend in the next phase of the research as data becomes available. Intellectus Statistics, an internet-based statistical analysis software program, was used for the binary logistic regression analysis. These results come with an important asterisk. McFadden R-squared values were calculated for each model to determine how well the models fit the observed data. For both the 2014 and the 2017 models, although the overall model was significant, the R-squared was 0.02, suggesting that the variables in this study accounted for only 2% of the variance in semester-to-semester retention. In other words, 98% of the variance was accounted for by other variables not in the model. Beyond the pilot phase of the research, it may be worthwhile to explore other variables in the datasets that would improve the fit of the model, since this is a major limitation. On this chart, significant findings by p-value are bolded. For the 2017 cohort, 2 race ethnicity variables had a significant effect on the odds of being retained. Students identifying as Asian had 60% greater odds of being retained, and students identifying as white had 49% greater odds of being retained. This warrants further review beyond the pilot phase of the study. If a progressive SAP policy with an advising hold component has the effect over the long term of increasing retention and eventually completion for Asian and white students who are already more likely to complete degrees, which therefore increases the completion gap, then such a policy would not be desirable in the quest for equity in education. For both cohorts, sex had a significant effect on the odds of being retained, with students identifying as female having 15% greater odds of being retained in the 2014 cohort, and students identifying as female in the 2017 cohort having 36% greater odds of being retained. Overall, it's not surprising to see females retained at a higher rate than males, but the increase in odds for the 2017 cohort points to the possibility that the advising hold requirement had a larger impact on male students' chances of being retained, and conversely that women are more likely to follow through with the advisor meeting to get their hold removed. For both cohorts, students taking remedial mathematics had 5% decreased chance of being retained for every 1 remedial mathematics credit that they took. This is not surprising, but given the similarity between cohorts, it appears that the SAP policy changes did not have an impact on the semester-to-semester retention of students based on their developmental course attempt status. Dependency status on the FAFSA had a significant effect on the odds of being retained for both cohorts, with dependent students having 37% lower odds of being retained in the 2014 cohort, while in the 2017 cohort, dependent students had 20% lower odds of being retained. This is a 17 percentage point narrowing of the gap, which warrants further attention beyond the pilot phase of this work. Although EFC had a significant effect on the odds of being retained, the odds increase was close to 0%, making it appear that EFC was not a good predictor of retention for these cohorts. Going forward, I will continue collecting data for the 2017 cohort through the spring 2020 semester, and at that point we'll analyze these data sets further. These preliminary results suggest the need to explore whether more outreach is needed for students who may have been disproportionately affected by the advising hold policy, including minoritized and male students. It may be useful to also determine the rates at which holds are being cleared for students in these groups. It's possible that an advising hold policy without a strong equity-focused outreach directive does more harm than good. It may also be useful to narrow the data sets further, focusing exclusively on students who fall below the eventual SAP thresholds in both cohorts. This would remove all students from the sample who always meet SAP thresholds and may isolate the effect of the SAP policy shift on the most relevant students. The datasets include information about the dollar amount expended for each student in terms of federal aid. If there's a difference in student success over the long term, it may be important to consider the actual cost of the increase in success. For example, it's possible that a slight increase in retention and completion under a progressive SAP policy is very costly, which would have policy implications. Finally, it is not possible within a single institution, but a randomized controlled trial in which some students are assigned to a fixed SAP policy and others are assigned to a progressive SAP policy or a waiver of policy altogether could be achieved across states or perhaps via a federal waiver of SAP policy at experimental sites. This would potentially help to establish whether SAP policy and the threat of aid loss is the best tool for improving student success. End of report.